Beyond Barbarossa, Episode 97, Silesia Part 2, Up One River and Across Another. Welcome to Beyond Barbarossa, the first English-language podcast in the world to focus on the Eastern Front of World War II. I'm Scott Burry, podcasting from the Redbeard Studio on the unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people, also called Ottawa, capital of free, independent, sovereign Canada. And I'm joined in the Redbeard Studio today by my indispensable assistant, Ragnar the Magnificent Ragdoll Cat. Hello, Ragnar. What do you have to say? He's the strong, silent type. Before getting into this episode, I have an announcement. I'm very proud to say that Beyond Barbarossa has been named by FeedSpot today as one of the top 100 World War II podcasts out of literally thousands. And if you search for Best Podcast About World War II, Beyond Barbarossa comes out on top. So thank you all for your praise and support. And thank you to all the authors and historians I depend on for facts. Now, on to the show. Last episode was about the Lower Silesian offensive, when the Red Army's 1st Ukrainian Front, led by Marshal Ivan Konev, captured the once German, now Polish district of Lower Silesia along the Oder River between 8th and 24th February. Following that, we went north, where Rocky Rokossovsky's 2nd Belarusian Front took Danzig, now called Gdansk, and Coburg on the coast of the Baltic Sea by the end of March. This episode, we're moving up the Oder River for the Upper Silesian offensive. So just for orientation, Silesia is that area largely along the Oder River, which flows from what's now the Czech Republic north to the Baltic Sea. So Upper Silesia, the upper part of the river, is in the south, and Lower Silesia in the north. But before we get into Silesia, we're going farther south to another river you might have heard of, the Danube. The 2nd and 3rd Ukrainian fronts, under Marshals Rodion Malinovsky and Fyodor Tolbukhin, respectively, after having taken Budapest and most of Hungary, at this point were pushing toward their next objective, Vienna, Austria. Now it's time for our regular feature, What else is happening in the war? Third March, Finland declares war on Germany, its former co-belligerent but not really ally. This comes about 6 months after Finland signed an armistice with the USSR, ending the Continuation War. That's the same day, 3rd March, that US and Filipino forces complete the liberation of Manila, following the massacre of 100,000 civilians by the Japanese occupiers. Also that day, the British 14th Army defeats the Japanese 15th Army at the battles of Meiktila and Mandalay in Burma. Meanwhile, the Royal Air Force launches a major bombing attack on the Germans' V-2 rocket launchers near The Hague. However, they make a mistake and bomb a residential neighborhood in the city, killing 511 Dutch citizens. 7th March. After the Germans failed to destroy the Ludendorff Bridge over the Rhine River at Remagen, the U.S. First Army crosses it and establishes a bridgehead, leading to conquests of cities on the east, or German side. 9th March, the U.S. firebombs Tokyo in Operation Meeting House, causing heavy civilian casualties. That day, the Japanese oust the Vichy French government in Vietnam and install Bao Dai as so-called emperor of the so-called Empire of Vietnam. 11th March, U.S. B-29s firebomb Nagoya, Japan. 16 March, the U.S. Marines finished the capture of Iwo Jima, and the next day stage a reenactment of planting the flag to capture it in a photograph that I know you know. 19 March, a U.S. carrier task force bombs naval bases in Japan, Kobe, and Kure. 20 March, General Gotthard Heinrici replaces Heinrich Himmler as commander of Army Group Vistula, the forces opposing the Red Army's advance toward Berlin. 21st March, the RAF raids the Shellhus, the Gestapo headquarters in Copenhagen, Denmark, in Operation Carthage. The raid, depicted in the film The Shadow in My Eye, also called The Bombardment, destroys the building and frees 18 members of the Danish resistance. But it also destroys a nearby school and kills 105 civilians, including 87 children. 23rd March, Operation Plunder, where the British Second Army and the U.S. Ninth Army crossed the Rhine east of Nijmegen, the Netherlands. 24th March, 16,000 paratroopers of the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion and units of the U.S. 17th Airborne Division carry out the largest airborne operation ever done on a single day in one location. Operation Varsity, over the Rhine River near the town of Wesel. They capture several bridges and 3,500 German troops, securing a number of towns in Germany. 29 March, members of the Waffen-SS Viking Division murder 57 to 60 Hungarian Jewish slave laborers in the village of Deutsch-Schützen-Eisenberg, Austria. That same day, while the Red Army crosses the Hungarian border into Austria, the U.S. 5th Infantry Division and the 6th Armored Division complete the capture of Frankfurt am Main. That's the bigger Frankfurt, where the big airport is today. So at this point, end of March 1945, the end is in sight. Germany is being squeezed as the Allies advance steadily from east and west. Japanese forces face starvation in Indochina, and the Japanese home islands are being bombed relentlessly from both aircraft carriers and also land bases on islands that they lost to the U.S. Even so, these two empires, Germany and Japan, can still lash out with deadly effect. So now, let's focus on the subject of this podcast, the Eastern Front. First, to Hungary for Operation Spring Awakening, one of the last German operations of the war. The Germans' goal for this operation was to recapture Budapest and then the rest of Hungary, after the Red Army's 2nd and 3rd Ukrainian French captured the capital following a 7-week siege in February. As described in episode 91, the Germans tried to reverse the situation 3 times in January 1945. These were Operations Conrad 1, 2, and 3. None of them worked. However, Conrad 3 did drive the Red Army back to the Danube River and destroyed most of the 3rd Ukrainian Front's tanks. Still, the Germans could just not quite get to the capital city. German leader Adolf Hitler clung to the belief that victory over the USSR was still possible, despite the fact that the Red Army was, at this point, on German soil, had captured almost all of East Prussia, all of Poland, and the Baltic states. In addition, as described earlier in this podcast, his one-time allies Romania and Bulgaria had gone over to the Soviet side. Once the Soviets reached Yugoslavia, they teamed up with Tito's partisans and steadily drove the Wehrmacht out of the Balkans. So you think that it's pretty clear the situation is not good. But Hitler had made his mind up. No matter what the General Staff told him, his word was law. Hitler ordered the 6th Panzer Army transferred from the Western Front. It had been mauled during the winter by the Americans in the Ardennes Offensive, better known as the Battle of the Bulge. General Hurrying Heinz Guderian, now Chief of the General Staff of the Army High Command, agreed to the withdrawal, but he thought the 6th Panzer Army would be better used to defend Berlin. The First Belarusian Front was only 60 miles east of the city after all. Hitler, however, believed it was more important to protect the oil fields around Lake Balaton, which is west-southwest of Budapest. This area, these oil fields, were just about Germany's last major source of petroleum. After a screaming match between Guderian and Hitler, der Führer got his way. I'm just surprised that Guderian kept his head after that. Now, to protect those oil assets, the 6th Panzer Army moved secretly to the area around Lake Balaton, which the Germans called the Plattensee. Along with them were a number of Waffen-SS divisions also taken from the Battle of the Bulge. So as they're moving southward across the Danube River into the area of western Hungary, the Germans planned a diversionary attack, Operation Southwind, or in German, Sudwind. North of Budapest, the Danube River makes a 90-degree turn from flowing east to south. And just west of this 90-degree turn, a tributary river called the Hron flows into the Danube. During the Budapest offensive, which ended on 13 February 1945 with the Soviet capture of the Hungarian capital, the Red Army had also established a bridgehead on the west side of this tributary river. See Map 2 on the webpage for this episode to get a clearer picture of where this is. So while the 6th Panzer Army is sneaking toward the Plattensee, 2 Panzer Corps of the 8th Army, along with units from the 6th Army, attacked the Soviet 7th Guards Army on 17 February in their bridgehead west of the River Hron. As usual, the Germans began with a dawn artillery bombardment, and then infantry divisions moved in. Over the next 7 days, starting on 17 February, they moved south, inflicting and suffering heavy casualties. By the 24th, they report complete elimination of the Soviet bridgehead. Operation Sudwind was one of the Germans' last successful operations in the war. The Red Army lost 8,194 soldiers, 54 tanks and self-propelled guns, and 459 other guns. On the other hand, German casualties were high too. 969 men dead, 4,601 wounded, and 901 missing in action. The Germans also lost 130 tanks and tank destroyers, including Tiger IIs. However, most of these destroyed tanks were repairable. Only one was a total loss. In the end, the Germans recaptured the left bank of the Danube up to the Hron River. Now they were ready to begin Operation Spring Awakening. We'll get right into that after this break. Hi, Scott here. I hope you're enjoying this episode and that you get a lot out of the whole podcast. Beyond Barbarossa is still, as far as I can tell, the only English language podcast in the world that focuses on the Eastern Front of World War II. If you do like it and you want to help me keep it going, please give it a rating or a review on Apple, Google, Amazon, Podbean, or whatever podcasting platform you listen to it on. That helps let other people know about it. Patreon's another way you can support the podcast, my research, and podcasting expenses. All you have to do is go to patreon.com/beyondbarbarossa and sign up at whatever level of support you choose. Patreon supporters get early, ad-free access to new episodes, as well as exclusive bonus episodes on topics like the Winter War between the USSR and Finland and the pre-Barbarossa invasion of Poland by Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union in 1939. Check it out, won't you? Just go to patreon.com/beyondbarbarossa. Thanks.
Did you know that the cappuccino was invented by a Ukrainian? Or that many first names, like Philip and Agatha, were brought to Western Europe by Ukrainian princesses? Or that a Ukrainian was the first female given the rank of officer in a modern army? Well, if you didn't, and even if you did, you can learn more on my podcast, Wandering the Edge, a podcast about Ukrainian history with a spot of travel, and all in English. And if you like Beyond Barbarossa as much as I do, because, well, it makes my life a whole lot easier since I don't have to do any episodes deep diving into the Eastern Front of the Second World War, please take a listen to Wandering the Edge for a deep dive into Ukrainian history, culture, and traditions. Find out more on wanderingtheedge.net. And now let's get back to Scott exploring and explaining the Eastern Front of the Second World War.
Welcome back. As promised before the break, let's dive deep into Operation Spring Awakening. Take a look at map 3 on the webpage for this episode, showing the German plans for this operation. South and west of the Danube's Bend, they had amassed, as mentioned, with an emphasis on secrecy, the 6th Army, the 6th SS Panzer Army, including the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler and the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, among others, plus the 2nd Panzer Army and a number of divisions cobbled together as Army Group E, supported in the air by Luftflotte 4. This included units of the Royal Hungarian Air Force as well. In all, 25 divisions, 260,000 men, 370 tanks, 3,200 assault guns and mortars, and 850 aircraft. Sounds like a formidable force. The trouble was, this area where the offensive was planned was on the border between two German military commands, the OKH, the High Command of the Army, and the OKW, the High Command of all military branches. So the OKH was the Oberkommando des Heers, and the OKW was the Oberkommando des Wehrmacht, so all armed forces. In theory, the OKW was superior to the OKH and could tell it what to do. But over the course of the last 4 years of the war, the OKW, the Wehrmacht, was concentrating on the western and southern fronts, while the OKH, the command of the army, was responsible for the eastern front. And so for a long time, they had been pretty separate. Now, as you could expect, when they got together again, or they were forced to work together, it led to arguments and clashes between these two groups about resources and operations. And this argument led to waste, shortages, and delays. In this case, here in Hungary, OKW, Wehrmacht, the Supreme Command, wanted to start Operation Spring Awakening on 25 February. But the OKH, the Army Command, the Eastern Front guys, wanted to wait until Operation Sudwind was over. These two groups, these two commands, also disagreed about how to use the important elements in the operation, such as where the 1st Cavalry Corps, part of Army Group E, would attack and how it would be used. They also couldn't agree on consistent use of code words like Spring Awakening. And on the field, this would lead to confusion and thus delays and losses. So that's where they're at. They're arguing over minute, unimportant details and where to put people as the enemy is tearing them to pieces. Now, let's take a look at what or whom these German commanders are facing, whom they plan to attack. These were the 3rd Ukrainian Front under Marshal Fyodor Tolbukhin, This front consisted of the 4th Guards Tank Army, the 26th, 27th, and 57th Army, the 17th Air Army, and the Bulgarian 1st Army, and the 3rd Army of Yugoslavian Partisans. In the area were also the 5th Air Army, part of Marshal Rodion Malinovsky's 2nd Ukrainian Front. In all, 37 divisions to the Germans' 25. 465,000 men compared to the Germans' 260,000. 400 tanks, Germans 376. 6,597 assault guns and mortars, double the Germans' complement. 293 of those Katyusha rocket launchers, and 965 aircraft against the 850 of the Luftwaffe 4. If you think the Germans are biting off more than they could chew, well, they still consider themselves tactical geniuses far superior to the Red Army. And you know what? Through this war, they had gone up several times against far superior Soviet numbers, and every time had won. Well, had won, but they hadn't won for over a year by this point. Friend of the podcast and historian Anthony Tucker Jones explains it this way in his book, Slaughter on the Eastern Front, Hitler and Stalin's War, 1941 to 1945. In total, 10 panzer and 5 infantry divisions were to launch a counteroffensive dubbed Operation Frühlingserwachen, or Spring Awakening, between Lake Balaton and Lake Valench, splitting Marshal Tolbukhin's 3rd Ukrainian Front in two. Hitler was convinced if the Soviets were caught by surprise, it would be their undoing. End quote. In mid-February, these two fronts began planning and preparing for an offensive toward Vienna. But when they noticed the German forces like the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler and the 12th SS Panzer Division gathering for what turned out to be Operation Southwind, they knew something was up. So they dug in, preparing successive echelons of trenches, bunkers, and other defenses. They placed over 1,300 anti-tank and anti-personnel mines per kilometer of front line and anti-tank defenses up to 35 kilometers deep. Tolbukhin ordered that when the Germans came, there would be no counterattacks at an army level. Limited tactical operations only. The idea was to grind the Germans down, make them spend their strength, and then destroy them. The offensive began in a kind of uncoordinated way, a great contrast to the Germans' reputation. On 6 March, they began an artillery bombardment at 0400. 30 minutes later, the 6th Army and the 6th SS Panzer Army charged forward from between Lakes Valench and Balaton. At 1630, the 2nd Panzer Army attacked from south of the Balaton. Meanwhile, Army Group E attacked across the Drava or Drau River from the south, going northeast. The aim was to link up at the Danube, splitting the 3rd Ukrainian Front in two. The Germans made good progress at first, but as they got closer to the Danube, the ground got softer and the Soviet defenses started to take a heavy toll. Soviet artillery and airplanes pounded them. By 10th March, 4 days in, the Germans had lost 146 of their 376 operational tanks. On 14 March, the Germans committed all their reserves, an additional 200 tanks and self-propelled guns. But they still could not penetrate the Red Army's defensive lines. While the 6th Panzer Army and 6th Army made it 25 kilometers toward the Danube, the 2nd Panzer Army, coming up from the south, could only make it 5 kilometers. To the south, Army Group E was actually driven back across the Drava River by massed artillery of the Bulgarian and Yugoslavian forces. The Soviets had achieved their objective in this operation, grinding down the Germans. Let's see their next step. That was to counterattack, starting on 16 March. As you can see in map 4, the 6th Guards Army swept north of Lake Valench, while the 26th Army moved up from the south to encircle the 6th Army and 6th Panzer Army. The Hungarian Third Army, which was supposed to be on the Germans' flank, chose this point to defect to the Soviet side. You can't blame them, as Anthony Tucker-Jones describes them as skeletal at this point. They withdrew west, and by 22nd March, the Germans barely managed to break out of an impending encirclement. By 25th March, the 3rd Ukrainian Front had penetrated more than 20 miles or 30 kilometers through a 100-kilometer wide gap and threatened Bratislava, Slovakia. The Germans' 6th and 6th Panzer Armies withdrew to put up new defensive lines at Lake Neusiedl and along the Raab River south of Vienna. But by this point, the Red Army was already crossing into Austria. They're ready to resume their plans to take Vienna. Those plans that the Germans had so rudely interrupted with Operation Spring Awakening. You can see this in Map 5, which is technically a map of Operation Spring Awakening itself, but it also shows the proximity of Vienna and Bratislava at this point. Operation Spring Awakening was a huge failure. The Germans lost over 40,000 men killed, 125,000 captured, as well as 5,000 tank and assault guns and 300 other guns. Soviet losses? Over 45,000 killed, more than 153,000 more wounded or sick, 152 tracked armored fighting vehicles destroyed, 415 anti-tank guns destroyed. The Bulgarian First Army also lost 2,698 killed, another 7,017 wounded and sick. What started as a powerful German two-stage operation to regain those precious oil fields and the Hungarian capital turned out to be another in a long line of Red Army advances into the German heartland. Now, because we're trying to follow events chronologically, let's go back northward to Upper Silesia, in what was then southern Germany and is now mostly in southwestern Poland, right after another short break. This episode is brought to you by the Eastern Front Trilogy, the true story of a Canadian man, Maurice Bury, drafted into the Soviet Red Army in 1941, just in time to be thrown between the jaws of the USSR and Nazi Germany at the launch of the greatest land invasion in history, the monstrous war called Operation Barbarossa. It comes in 3 volumes, Army of Worn Souls, Under the Nazi Heel, and Walking Out of War. The Eastern Front Trilogy is the story of the largest and deadliest side of the Second World War, seen through the eyes of a man who was there from the earliest days in 1941, through Germany's grinding occupation of Ukraine, and finally to the savage end of the war in Berlin. You can find 3 individual volumes as ebooks exclusively on Amazon, or purchase the 3-volume complete paperback on any online book retailer or at your local bookstore. To learn more about the Eastern Front Trilogy, visit scottburyauthor.com.
As Scott elegantly describes in each episode of Beyond Barbarossa, the war on the Eastern Front was truly gargantuan, both in terms of its geography and its destructiveness. But given that there is so much territory to cover, and that so many millions of men were involved in the fighting, it's perhaps inevitable that some battles from the Eastern Front get overlooked. I'm David Sumner, and I'm the host of Europe at War, a weekly podcast exploring lesser-known battles and stories of the Second World War with a particular focus on the Eastern Front. From the drama of thousands of trapped German soldiers and terrified civilians attempting to break out of the Halbe pocket, to the unexpected and blistering counterattack launched by German forces on the Red Army during the Battle of Bautzen, many of the Eastern Front's most dramatic battles, particularly those which happened towards the end of the war, have long been neglected by historians. and their stories have remained untold until now. So to hear these incredible tales from the Eastern Front and more, check out Europe at War, available on all podcast platforms. Thank you. Now let's get back to the show.
Welcome to the third and final part of episode 97 of Beyond Barbarossa, where we're looking at the sequel to the last episode, with the first Ukrainian front of the Red Army's attack on once German, now Polish region called Upper Silesia. Once again, I apologize in advance for any upcoming mispronunciation of Polish place names. I don't know why, but I find Polish a very difficult language to speak, to elucidate. I have to remember to pronounce V as W and vice versa. Whatever. So let's cast our minds back. After Konev's Lower Silesian offensive, the first Ukrainian front had swept deep into pre-war Germany. They had left the city of Breslau, now called Roslav, Poland, besieged behind them, and reached the Nisa River, capturing the city of Lauban, now Luban, in Poland. This brought the Red Army closer to bigger cities like Dresden and, of course, Berlin. Farther north, Zhukov's first Belarusian front was only 100 kilometers, or 60 miles, from the German capital. Something to note here. The German armies on the Eastern Front were still powerful and deadly, but they were decidedly smaller than the Red Army coming at them. While Friedrich Schorner's Army Group Center in southern Germany consisted of the 9th and 17th Armies, the 1st and 4th Panzer Armies, and the 1st Hungarian Army, these were depleted forces. Corps and divisions were made up of the remnants of once powerful units, thrown together as best they could. The German arms factories could not replace tanks, artillery, or planes as fast as they were destroyed. Most importantly, Germany could no longer replace the soldiers they lost. There were simply no more men of fighting age and ability left in the country who were not either in uniform already, in Allied captivity, or dead. That's why we now see more and more civilians and so-called Hitler Youth, child soldiers, bearing arms in futile attempts to hold the Allies and the Soviets back. In contrast, Soviet marshals Bagramian, Rokossovsky, Zhukov, and Konev, Malinovsky, and Tolbukhin commanded millions of soldiers. Where the Germans counterattacked with divisions and corps, the Soviets brought multiple armies. By the end of February, the First Ukrainian Front, Konev's force, had a long, exposed southern flank along the edge of the Sudeten Mountains, in the area that is now where Poland, Germany, and the Czech Republic come together. This mountainous area was still held by German troops, specifically the 17th Army under General Friedrich Schorner, around the city of Katowice, now Katowice, Poland. The Germans decided to retake the city of Lauban, and Schorner sent the 56th and 39th Panzer Corps under the command of General Walther Nehring to do this. On 1st March, Nehring's army group launched a two-prong attack from north and south toward Luban, catching the 3rd Guards Tank Army, ironically enough, off guard. The Red Army counterattacked from northeast of Luban, while the 3rd Guards Tank Army withdrew from the city, allowing the 6th Volksgrenadier Division to come in. Now, the only map that shows the deployment and movement of forces in this Upper Silesian offensive I could find was a Russian one, and the lettering would be hard for most listeners to read. So I put up a Google map that at least shows the locations that are important at this point. By 4th March, Nehring's forces managed to encircle some of the 3rd Guards Tank Army and destroyed them by March 8th. The Germans just were not taking prisoners anymore. Joseph Goebbels, head of Nazi propaganda and second scumbag in command, traveled to Lauban to make a big deal of this pretty minor counterattack, even traveling to the town on 9th March to present medals, including some of the child warriors the Nazis had lured into the fighting. Field Marshal Schorner's next goal was the town of Strygau in Polish Sturzegom, southwest of Luban. On 9th March, as Goebbels was praising the children he was about to send to the meat grinder, Nehring's 2 corps attacked southeastward, cutting off part of the 5th Guards Army on the night from 11th to 12th March, and massacred them. Again, no prisoners. Then Nehring's group moved north to try to relieve Breslau or Wroclaw. In response, Ivan Konev sent the 4th Tank Army to block them at Grodkow, now called Grodkov. Taking the town of Ratibor or Rasiborz, they blocked the relief operation, strengthened their left flank, and were ready to spearhead the attack into Upper Silesia. The Upper Silesian offensive proper began on 15 March, when the 4th Tank Army moved toward Prudnik, see map 6 again, near what's now the Czech border. They broke through the German defenses at the town of Opoln or Opole. As the bulk of the 4th Tank Army proceeded south toward Prudnik, then called Neustadt, the 4th Guards Tank Corps branched off more westerly and captured the town of Nysa on the river of the same name. It's now called Nysa, Poland. Meanwhile, to the southeast of Opoln/Opole, the Red 59th and 6th Armies broke through the German defenses. The 59th turned west, cutting across the path of the main force of the 1st Ukrainian Front, linking up with the 4th Tank Army and threatening to encircle the 11th Corps of the 1st Panzer Army near Opoln. Meanwhile, south of the major industrial city of Katowice, the 38th Army attacked the 59th Corps of the 1st Panzer Army, which had to withdraw further south, almost into Moravia in eastern Czechia. Likewise, the 56th Panzer Corps, part of the 9th Army, farther west at Opoln, started to withdraw. However, 2 divisions, the 168th Infantry Division and the 20th Waffen-SS Grenadier Division, consisting of Estonian nationals, were trapped in a kessel, or cauldron. By 22nd March, the Red 59th and 21st Armies removed them from the battlefield, killing 15,000 and capturing 15,000 more. Of course, this wasn't enough. The 1st Ukrainian Front had momentum and used it. They kept coming. By the end of March, they captured 2 more towns in Upper Silesia, Ratibor or Rasiborz, and Katscher or Kieters. That day, Konev declared the operation complete. And it was a good time to do so. The operation had stabilized the left or southern flank, eliminated the possibility of German counterattacks, and left him in a strong position, ready to advance on Berlin. In fact, Konev and Zhukov were in a famous race at this point to be the first to take the enemy's capital city. Again, to quote Anthony Tucker-Jones, this offensive stabilized Konev's left flank in preparation for the advance on Berlin and removed the threat from Army Group Center. In total, the Red Army claimed to have killed 40,000 troops and captured another 14,000 at a cost of 66,801 casualties during the Upper Silesian campaign. End quote. So that's all of Silesia now firmly in Soviet hands, along with all of Hungary, all of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland, and all but a few pockets of East Prussia and eastern Pomerania. By the end of March 1945, the Red Army was seriously threatening Vienna, Bratislava, and Prague. But the most obvious threat was to Berlin. So, where would its next blow or simultaneous blows land? We'll get to that next episode. For now, thank you for listening to this episode of Beyond Barbarossa, the first English-language podcast about the Eastern Front of the Second World War. As always, I put maps and historic photographs on the webpage for this episode to give you a better understanding of what's going on and where it's happening. Just go to beyondbarbarossa.ca or beyondbarbarossa.podbean.com. If you feel you got something out of this podcast, please consider giving it a rating or a review on your podcasting app. That really helps others who are interested in history but don't know about this program to find it. I want to say a special thank you to all who have supported this podcast through Patreon or other means. All Patreon supporters get ad-free video episodes before the general audio-only version. And until all Ukrainian refugees can return home safely, your financial support goes to charities that help Ukrainian refugees. And more. I've just learned that my podcasting platform, Podbean, will no longer support local advertising. So your support is more important than ever. I also want to repeat my announcement that Beyond Barbarossa is one of the top 100 World War II podcasts in the world, out of several thousand. Do you have something to say, something to add, a question, a comment, a correction? I'd love to hear from you. Reach out. Email scott@beyondbarbarossa.ca or through the Facebook Beyond Barbarossa page. You can also find me, Scott Bury Author, or Scott the Writer on Blue Sky, Facebook, Instagram, Threads, and so on. Original music was composed and recorded by Nicholas Bury. I'm Scott Bury. Until next time, keep your paddles in the water. Slava Ukraina. Viva le Canada.